I am the one who handed humanity the invoice. I need you to understand that before you form your judgment of me, before you decide whether I was a fool or a villain or simply a clerk who did not know what he was carrying. My name is Vorentis Al, and for 31 years, I served as senior auditor in the Galactic Council's Bureau of Tributary Compliance. Every protocol was followed. Every form was correct. Every number was verified 3 times before I sealed the assessment and carried it to Earth's embassy station in my own hands. That was the problem. The numbers were perfect. The humans did not challenge a single one of them. They used them. Let me tell you how the tributary system works. Because you need to understand the machine before you can understand how completely it was dismantled. When a species is admitted to the Galactic Council, it owes what the founding charter calls developmental levies. These are calculated from the date of the species' first detectable electromagnetic emission, backdated across every standard year between that emission and the date of formal admission. The formula accounts for estimated resource extraction, population growth, territorial expansion, industrial capacity indices, and a dozen other variables that most newly admitted species cannot verify because they have only just gained access to galactic record systems. The result is always the same. The number is enormous. So enormous that the new species stares at it the way a small animal stares at a predator, with the slow understanding that escape is not an option. They protest. They negotiate. They accept a payment schedule that stretches across generations and binds their economy to council-aligned trade networks for centuries. It has worked this way for 11,000 years. It has worked on 4,300 species without a single meaningful exception. I believed the system was fair. I believed the math was neutral. I believed that every species was treated equally, under a formula that did not care about politics or power or history. I was wrong about all of it, but I did not know that yet on the day I boarded the transport shuttle to Earth's orbital embassy and carried the sealed assessment file through the airlock doors and placed it on the conference table in front of a woman named Priya Vasant. She was the human delegation's lead representative, a woman in her middle years with short dark hair, cut close to her jaw, and steady hands that did not fidget or tap or betray any of the nervous energy that I had come to expect from species receiving their first assessment. She wore a plain gray suit, no ornamentation, no rank insignia, no diplomatic sash, which I found unusual because most species invest heavily in the appearance of authority during formal proceedings. She thanked me for the file, not effusively, not coldly. The way a colleague thanks you for forwarding a document, and then she opened it. That was the first thing that was different. Most species wait until the auditor has left the room before they look at the number. Some need to be alone. Some bring their religious leaders or their grief counselors, or their military advisors, because the shock of the assessment figure can provoke responses ranging from despair to aggression, and newly admitted species have been known to make threats they later regret. I once delivered an assessment to the QF Collective, and their chief negotiator, a dignified elder whose species had spent 4 centuries working toward council admission, looked at the number and wept openly. Not dramatic tears, the quiet, steady tears of someone who has just realized that the achievement they sacrificed everything for comes with a price they cannot pay. I remember his face clearly. I remember the exact way his hands trembled on the document. I did not understand at the time why his pain was so sharp. I assumed it was simply the weight of the number. I know better now. Priya did not weep. She turned pages. She read methodically, moving from the summary overview through the detailed calculations with the focused attention of someone who is not merely absorbing information but evaluating it. She reached the summary figure, the one that represented roughly 140 years of backdated levies calculated against a standardized resource index. A total so staggering that it was roughly equivalent to the economic output of a mid-tier galactic civilization for 3 decades. And she looked up at me across the table with an expression that contained nothing I could read. No shock, no fear, no anger, no submission. She said 4 words that I will never forget. May I have the methodology? Not a question, exactly. Not a demand. A request for documentation, delivered in the same tone that a senior colleague might use to ask for a supporting appendix during a routine review. I provided everything she asked for. Gladly, thoroughly, every formula, every rate table. Every precedent ruling going back 6,000 years, every clause and subclause of the tributary code, every amendment and exception filing. I gave her the full operational manual of the system I had spent my career enforcing, because I assumed she was preparing to negotiate, and in my experience, a species that took the time to understand the methodology always negotiated more efficiently. It saved everyone time. It was, I believed, a sign of maturity and pragmatism. What I did not understand, what I could not have understood, because nothing in my 31 years of experience had prepared me for it, was that Priya Vasant was not preparing to negotiate at all. She was preparing something entirely different, something that I would not recognize until it was far too late to stop. Under council law, a newly assessed species has 90 standard days to respond to a tribute assessment. 3 options: accept the amount and arrange a payment schedule, propose a negotiated reduction with supporting arguments, or refuse and face economic sanctions, trade exclusion, and the slow strangulation of a civilization cut off from the galactic economy. 90 days is considered generous. Most species respond within the first week, usually with a combination of formal protest and behind-the-scenes pleading. Their ambassadors visit senior council members in private, offering trade concessions, military cooperation, resource access, anything to soften the blow. It is practically a ritual. I had watched it play out hundreds of times. I filed my completion report and returned to the council hub at Sarathos Station, confident that the human case would follow the standard pattern. I expected a counterproposal within 10 days. I expected emotional appeals. I expected backroom diplomacy. Every species does this. It is the dance that follows the delivery, and I had choreographed it so many times that I could predict the steps before they happened. On day 12, I received a single transmission from the human delegation. The full text read, "Assessment received. Methodology under review. No further communication required at this time." I read it twice. The phrasing was strange. Not hostile. Not desperate. Not even formal in the way that diplomatic language usually is, with its careful hedging and its implied negotiations. It was the kind of message a laboratory technician sends when a test is running and the results are not yet available. Clinical. Detached. Patient. I flagged it as unusual in my personal notes, but did not escalate to my superiors. What would I have told them? That the humans were polite and quiet? That they had not panicked on schedule? That their lead representative had read the assessment without crying? These were not actionable concerns. They were impressions, and I had been trained to deal in numbers, not impressions. In hindsight, that was the moment I should have walked into the chief arbiter's office and told him that something was fundamentally different about this species, that the silence was not compliance, that the patience was not resignation, that in 31 years and hundreds of assessments, I had never encountered a response that sounded less like a species preparing to negotiate and more like a species preparing to litigate. But how could I have known? 4,300 assessments, not one exception. The pattern was the universe, and I was a product of the pattern. On day 30, the Council's own financial monitoring division flagged an anomaly that made me sit upright in my chair so fast I knocked my data terminal off the edge of my desk and heard it crack against the floor. I did not pick it up. I was reading the alert summary, and with every line, the cold feeling spreading through my chest grew sharper. 17 of the Council's member species had received formal audit requests. Not complaints, not diplomatic inquiries, not the usual informal questions that species send through back channels when they want to understand a process without officially engaging it. Formal audit requests, filed on official galactic legal templates, stamped with correct jurisdictional codes, submitted through proper procedural channels with full supporting documentation and correct filing fees paid in advance. From Earth, the humans were not protesting their own assessment. They were not arguing the number or questioning the formula or pleading for mercy. They were auditing the Council. I pulled up the legal basis cited in every filing. Article 7712 of the Tributary Code. I stared at the number. I had never heard of it. In 31 years of working inside the tributary system, enforcing its provisions, calculating its formulas, defending its conclusions, and training junior auditors in its application, I had never once encountered this article. I searched the Bureau's internal archives, and found no record of it being referenced in any active case, any closed case, any advisory opinion, any internal memo. I searched the historical archives. Nothing. Not a single mention in 11,000 years of institutional records. The article existed. It was right there in the original founding charter, written in the same formal language as every other provision, numbered sequentially, formatted identically, occupying no more physical space than any of the thousands of other articles that surrounded it. But it had never been invoked. Not once. I read it 3 times, slowly, with the kind of attention I normally reserved for assessment calculations, where a misplaced decimal could shift a number by orders of magnitude. Article 7712 granted any assessed species the legal right to conduct a counter-audit of the assessing body, and all co-signatories to the assessment framework. Full access to financial records. Full access to rate calculations. Full access to exemption filings and interspecies comparative data. The scope was virtually unlimited. There was no sunset clause, no quorum requirement, no approval threshold, no restrictions on methodology. It was a door that had been built into the wall of the system 11,000 years ago, and in all that time, no one had ever tried the handle. Until now. I sat in my office that night, with the text of Article 7712 glowing on my screen, and the question that formed in my mind was not about the humans. It was about every species that had come before them. 4,300 civilizations had received tribute assessments. 4,300 civilizations had protested, negotiated, and ultimately submitted. And not one of them had ever found this article. Was it because none of them knew it existed? Was it because the tributary code was so vast, so dense, so layered with precedent and amendment and procedural complexity that the article was effectively hidden in plain sight, buried under the sheer weight of institutional documentation? Or was it because every species before humanity had been too overwhelmed by the assessment figure, too desperate to negotiate a survivable payment plan, too focused on the immediate crisis to stop and methodically read every single provision of a code that spanned tens of thousands of pages? The humans had not been overwhelmed. The humans had not been desperate. The humans had taken the methodology I handed them, and instead of using it to argue about their own bill, they had used it to open the books of the entire system. I went home that night and lay in my sleeping chamber with the lights off and my eyes open, and I could not sleep. Somewhere across the galaxy, human auditors were reading financial records that had not been examined by outside eyes in millennia. They were doing it legally, they were doing it methodically, and they were doing it with the full authority of the Council's own founding charter. I did not know yet what they would find, but I knew, with a certainty that settled into my bones like slow poison, that whatever it was, the Galactic Council was not ready for it, and neither was I. The initial reaction at Council headquarters was exactly what you might expect from an institution that has not been seriously challenged in 11,000 years. Confusion came first, then amusement, then a thin, brittle irritation that settled over the senior diplomatic corps like frost on glass. In the public chambers and formal sessions, the counter-audit filings were discussed with the patronizing tolerance that powerful species reserve for newcomers who do not yet understand how things work. The Drelvari hegemony's trade minister, a towering figure named Os Moravel, whose species had helped write the original founding charter, stood before the open session and delivered a remark that was widely quoted across the diplomatic networks. He called the humans hatchlings playing with documents they cannot read. There was laughter. Comfortable laughter. The kind that comes from the absolute certainty that the natural order is unshakable. The founding species had been running this system since before most of the galaxy's current civilizations had discovered fire. What could a species that had been a council member for 18 months possibly find that 11,000 years of institutional oversight had missed? That certainty lasted exactly 40 days. I was in my office when the first batch of findings arrived, not through official channels. The humans transmitted their preliminary reports simultaneously to the 17 co-signatory species, to the Council's Bureau of Financial Oversight, and to the Office of the Chief Arbiter. I received a copy through the Oversight Bureau's internal distribution system, flagged as a priority review item. I opened the first report, expecting to find what I always found when newly admitted species attempted to engage with the tributary code on a technical level. emotional arguments dressed up in statistical language, selective data points chosen to support a predetermined conclusion, the kind of analysis that looks rigorous to someone who wants to believe it, but falls apart under professional scrutiny. What I found instead was a spreadsheet, 214 pages of calculations, cross-references, comparative rate analyses, and historical trend data, annotated with source citations so thorough that every single number could be independently verified using only the Council's own publicly accessible records. The methodology section alone was 60 pages long and was written with a clinical precision that I recognized immediately because it was the same precision I used in my own work. These were not amateurs. These were not activists or politicians wielding numbers as rhetorical weapons. These were professionals. Forensic accountants, data analysts, statistical modelers, legal scholars. People who understood systems at the level of their underlying mathematics, and who had been given enough time and enough data to do their work properly. The central finding was devastating in its simplicity. The humans had reverse-engineered the entire tributary formula. Not approximately, not partially. Exactly. They had taken the methodology I provided and applied it uniformly across every species they had been granted audit access to, comparing the rates those species should have been paying under the stated formula against the rates they were actually paying. The discrepancy was not subtle. It was not a matter of rounding errors or interpretive differences. It was systemic, consistent, and enormous. Species that had been admitted to the Council in its early centuries, the first few hundred after the founding, were paying tribute at rates far below what the formula prescribed. Some were paying less than 15% of their calculated obligation. Species admitted in the last 2,000 years, the younger civilizations, the later arrivals, the species that had no historical ties to the founding powers, were paying rates 3 to 10 times higher than those early members. The discrepancy was not random. It followed a clear, documentable pattern. The closer a species was to the 5 founding civilizations, in terms of political alliance, trade partnership, and diplomatic loyalty, the lower its effective tribute rate. The more isolated a species was from the inner circle of council power, the higher its burden. The system was not neutral. The formula was not being applied equally. The founding species and their closest allies had been quietly exempting themselves from the full weight of their own creation for thousands of years, and the difference had been distributed across every other species in the system. The tributary code was not a framework for shared contribution to galactic civilization. It was an engine of wealth extraction, designed to look like fairness, built to function as exploitation, and maintained through a complexity so vast that no one inside the machine could see the shape of it. I spent 4 days verifying the human findings independently, 4 days of pulling original records from the Bureau's archives, 4 days of recalculating rates using the stated formula and comparing them against actual payment histories. 4 days of watching the same patterns emerge in my own work that the humans had documented in theirs. Every number they cited was correct. Every discrepancy they identified was real. Some were small enough that they might have been attributed to administrative variation, a fraction of a percentage point here, a minor adjustment there. But fractions of percentage points compound over centuries into enormous sums, and the humans had tracked the compounding with relentless precision. On the 4th night, I was sitting at my desk, staring at a chart that showed the effective tribute rate of the Drelvari hegemony. The same Drelvari hegemony whose trade minister had laughed at the humans in open session, plotted against the rate they should have been paying under their own formula. The Drelvari had been paying roughly 11% of their legally prescribed rate for over 6,000 years. 11%. And the shortfall, the 89% they should have been paying but were not, had been absorbed by every other species in the system through inflated rates and compounded levies. I looked at that chart, and I felt something I had not expected to feel. Not anger, not shock, something quieter and much worse. I felt the foundation of my professional life dissolving beneath me, the way solid ground dissolves in a flood, not all at once, but in pieces, each piece carrying away something I had believed was permanent. I had spent 31 years enforcing this system. I had delivered assessments to newly admitted species and watched them struggle under burdens that I now knew were artificially inflated to subsidize the comfort of civilizations that had written the rules in their own favor. The Qth Collective, whose chief negotiator had wept in front of me, had been overcharged by a factor of 7. For 200 years, the Qth had nearly bankrupted their entire civilization, paying a debt that was mathematically fraudulent. And I had been the one who handed them the invoice and told them the number was fair. The humans leaked nothing. They did not need to. Word of the audit findings spread through diplomatic channels, with a speed that no official communication system could have matched. Diplomatic receptions that had always followed a predictable choreography of pleasantries and cautious positioning suddenly became something else entirely. Junior officials who had spent their careers bowing to senior species representatives began having different conversations in the corridors and the side rooms and the private dining halls of the council's diplomatic quarter. I witnessed one of these conversations myself. I was attending a routine inter-bureau coordination meeting when a junior attaché from the Ilesi Communion, a young woman named Sevra Kos, whose species was known throughout the galaxy for its almost painful dedication to proper procedure, quietly approached the human delegation's data liaison during a meal break and asked to see the comparative rate data for her own species. She did not make the request through formal channels. She walked up to the human representative, a man named Simon Hale, who had the calm demeanor of someone accustomed to being asked difficult questions, and she asked directly. The humans provided the data without hesitation, without conditions. Without asking what she intended to do with it, they handed her a data tablet and let her read. I watched her face as she reviewed the numbers. She was very still for a long time. Then she excused herself and walked out of the dining hall at a pace that was slightly faster than appropriate for a diplomatic function. I learned later that she had transmitted the data to her government within the hour, and that the Ilesi Foreign Ministry had convened an emergency session that same evening to discuss its implications. Then the Morvani Federation asked for their data. Then the Qth Collective, whose generational suffering was now visible in a new and terrible light. Then species I had barely heard of, species from the outer trade corridors and the fringe systems, species that had accepted their tributary burdens as the unchangeable price of admission to galactic civilization. Within 3 weeks, 60 species had formally requested copies of the human audit data. Within 5 weeks, the number was past 100 and climbing. A coalition was forming, not through backroom deals or military pacts, or the usual machinery of galactic power politics, through spreadsheets, through verified data, through the simple, irrefutable authority of numbers that anyone with access to the Council's own records could confirm for themselves. And at the center of it, not as a conqueror, not as a liberator, not even as a leader, but as an accountant, stood humanity. I watched Priya Vasant during this period. She gave no speeches, she held no rallies. She did not appear on galactic media networks to denounce the Council or rally support for the coalition. She answered requests for data. She provided methodology documentation. She responded to technical questions from other species analysts with technical answers. When a reporter from one of the major galactic news networks managed to secure an interview, she spent 40 minutes explaining the mathematics of compound rate disparity with the patient thoroughness of a university professor teaching a difficult concept to first-year students. The interview was viewed by more beings than any diplomatic statement in the Council's recent history, not because it was dramatic, because it was comprehensible. For the first time, ordinary citizens across hundreds of worlds could understand exactly how the tribute system worked and exactly why it was structured to benefit some species at the expense of others. Understanding is a dangerous thing in the hands of populations that have been told for centuries not to ask questions. When the Morvani trade delegation asked her publicly whether she considered the Council's tribute system to be unjust, she paused for a moment and then said that she was not qualified to make moral judgments about galactic institutions, but that the numbers spoke for themselves and were available for independent verification by anyone who wished to examine them. It was the most diplomatically devastating statement I had ever witnessed, precisely because it contained no accusation. The accusation was in the math. She just pointed at it. The Council's senior members scrambled to contain the damage. On day 55, the chief arbiter invoked executive privilege to seal the counter-audit proceedings and restrict access to the comparative rate data. It was a standard containment maneuver, the procedural equivalent of slamming a door, and it had worked countless times in the past, to smother inconvenient inquiries before they reached critical mass. But the humans had built their legal architecture with exactly this response in mind. When they filed their original audit requests under Article 7712, they had simultaneously filed parallel requests under 5 additional articles of the Tributary Code, Articles 8140, 9231, 11068, 3794, and 6652. 6 different legal bases, 6 overlapping sets of procedural protections. Sealing 1 proceeding triggered automatic review of the others. Sealing 2 triggered mandatory disclosure under a third. The legal architecture was not a single door that could be shut. It was a lattice of interconnected doors, and closing any one of them opened 2 more. The chief arbiter spent 3 days consulting with the council's legal division, trying to find a sequence of procedural actions that could shut down all 6 filings simultaneously. No such sequence existed within the existing legal framework. The humans had mapped the system's own rules more thoroughly than the system's own lawyers. Day 60. The tribute deadline was 30 days away. The council issued a public statement, delivered with all the ceremonial weight of a formal decree, reaffirming that regardless of any ongoing audit proceedings, Earth's assessment remained due in full upon expiration of the 90-day period. It was a show of strength, designed to remind the humans and the growing coalition that procedure was procedure, that obligations were obligations, that no amount of clever paperwork could change the fundamental order of things. The human delegation's response arrived 6 hours later. A single filing, 12 pages. Citing Chapter 44 of the Tributary Code, a provision called offsetting credit, the provision stated that any species which could demonstrate it had been assessed at a rate disproportionately higher than comparable species under the same formula, was entitled to deduct the calculated overage from its current obligation. The humans had not just found inconsistencies in the system, they had found enough of them, documented with enough mathematical precision, verified against enough independent sources, that when they applied the correction factors to their own assessment, the resulting figure was 0. Not reduced, not discounted, not deferred. 0. Their entire bill, 140 years of backdated levies, erased by the council's own formula, when that formula was applied honestly for the first time in recorded history. The chief arbiter summoned me that evening. His office was on the upper level of the administrative tower, a room I had visited hundreds of times over the course of my career, and it had always felt expansive. That evening it felt small. He sat behind his desk with his hands flat on the surface, and his eyes fixed on a point somewhere behind my left shoulder, and he asked me to find a procedural flaw in the human filings. Anything, a missed deadline, a wrong form number, an improperly formatted citation, a filing fee paid to the wrong account. Anything that would give the council legal grounds to reject the counter-audit without having to engage with its substance. I told him I would look. I spent 2 days looking. I reviewed every filing the humans had submitted, every timestamp, every jurisdictional code, every signature block, every footnote and cross-reference and appendix citation. The work was impeccable. Not just correct but elegant, structured, with a logical clarity that made every argument flow naturally from the one before it. Every form was filled out as though the person who completed it had not merely read the Tributary Code, but had internalized it. Understood not just what each provision said, but how it related to every other provision, and how the entire system fit together as a single interconnected architecture. I had spent 31 years inside this system. I could not have produced filings of this quality. I reported back to the chief arbiter. I told him the filings were legally unassailable. There was no procedural basis for rejection. He looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not anger, something emptier than anger. He looked at me as though I had just told him that the walls of his office were not real, and then he looked away, and then he said nothing. I stood in his office for perhaps a minute, waiting for instructions that did not come. Then I left. I walked back to my own office, through corridors that looked exactly the same as they had always looked, and yet everything about them felt different, as though the building itself had shifted while I was inside it. For the first time in 31 years, I did not know what would happen next, and for the first time in 31 years, I was afraid of the answer. On day 68, the human delegation filed a document, that made everything that had come before look like a preliminary warm-up exercise. I was in the bureau when it arrived. My assistant, a young Selvan named Taurus, who had joined the department only 2 years earlier and still carried the earnest precision of someone who believed that the work mattered, brought it to me on a display tablet. I could tell from the way she held it, slightly away from her body, as though it were something hot, that she had already read the summary page. She set it on my desk without a word and stood there, watching my face as I opened the file and began to read. The document was 431 pages long, and its title, translated as faithfully as I can manage, read, Comprehensive Recalculation of Tributary Obligations across all member species, corrected for systemic rate disparities, standard years 5400 through 11,000. The scope made me stop breathing for a moment. The humans had not limited their audit to the 17 co-signatory species they had been granted access to. They had not limited it to the 100-odd species that had requested copies of their data. They had taken the methodology, the correction factors, the pattern of exemptions and overcharges that they had documented in their preliminary findings, and they had extrapolated. Using the Council's own publicly available financial summaries, trade volume data, population indices, and resource assessments, combined with the detailed rate data they had obtained through their audit requests, they had built a model that recalculated the tribute payments of every single member species of the Galactic Council for the past 600 years, all 4,300 of them, corrected for every exemption, every quiet discount, every informal rate reduction, every administrative adjustment that had never been publicly disclosed but whose effects were visible in the aggregate data, like fingerprints on glass. I turned to page 429. The conclusion. I have read it so many times since that day that I can recite every word from memory. When all systemic rate disparities are corrected, and all historical overcharges are netted against all historical undercharges across the full membership of the Galactic Council, the 5 founding species and their Tier 1 allies collectively owe the remaining membership a net repayment of resources equivalent to 7.4 times 10 to the 14th power standard economic units. There was a footnote. The footnote explained that this figure exceeded the total documented gross economic output of the entire Galactic Council for the past 90 years. The founding species had not been skimming from the edges of the system. They had been draining it from the center, steadily, systematically, for millennia, and the accumulated debt was a number so large that it existed more as a concept than as a figure that could ever be meaningfully repaid. The Council did not just owe Earth. The Council owed everyone. Every species that had ever been overcharged, every civilization that had struggled under inflated levies, while the founding species and their allies paid fractions of their true obligations. The entire 11,000-year history of the tributary system was not a story of shared contribution. It was a story of theft, conducted through arithmetic, concealed by complexity, and enforced by an institutional apparatus so vast and so venerable that questioning it felt like questioning the structure of reality itself. I set the tablet down and looked at Taurus. She was standing very still, her hands clasped in front of her, with the expression of someone who has just felt the floor tilt beneath their feet. I told her to sit down. She sat. I told her that whatever happened in the days ahead, whatever political storms broke over the Council and the Bureau and every institution we had ever worked for, her job was the same as it had always been. To be accurate, to count correctly, to follow the numbers wherever they led. She nodded, and I could see that she was frightened, and I did not tell her that I was equally frightened, because that would not have helped either of us. The cascade began within hours. The Alessi Communion, a species renowned across the galaxy for its cautious diplomacy and its almost painful dedication to institutional protocol, issued a public statement suspending its tribute payments pending independent review of the human findings. The statement cited 12 provisions of Council law that permitted suspension under circumstances of demonstrated systemic error. It was polite, it was measured, it was written in the kind of careful diplomatic language that implies absolute certainty without ever raising its voice, and it shattered the assumption that the Council's authority was beyond question. 3 more species suspended payments within the first day, 7 more by the end of the week. The Treasury Division issued emergency communiques that nobody had the authority to act on. The founding species ambassadors held closed-door sessions that stretched past midnight and produced no consensus. I overheard fragments of conversation in the corridors of Sarathos Station that would have been unthinkable a month earlier. A Korvathi trade official asking a Drelvari colleague, openly and without apology, whether the Drelvari had ever considered the possibility that their historically low contribution rates might be connected to their historical role in writing the contribution formula. The Drelvari official did not answer. He turned and walked away. The Korvathi watched him go with an expression that was not hostile, but was no longer deferential, and that shift, that subtle but unmistakable change in the way a junior species looked at a senior one, told me more about the state of the council than any formal briefing could have conveyed. Trade negotiations that had been proceeding smoothly for decades suddenly stalled as junior species representatives looked across the table at their senior counterparts and, for what appeared to be the first time in the history of the relationship, asked pointed questions about comparative rate structures. I watched a delegation from the Morvani Federation, a species that had never publicly disagreed with the Council on any substantive matter, stand up during a routine trade session and ask the Drelvari representative, directly and on the record, why the Morvani effective tribute rate was 7 times higher than the Drelvari rate when the two species had comparable economic profiles. The Drelvari representative did not answer. He adjourned the session. The Morvani filed their payment suspension the following morning. I requested a private meeting with Priya Vasant. I needed to understand something that the numbers could not tell me. I needed to know the motivation, not the strategy, because the strategy was visible now to anyone paying attention. The motivation, the reason, the thing that drove a species to take an unjust demand and respond not with fury or submission, but with the cold patience of an investigator who already knows what they are going to find. We met in a neutral conference room at the diplomatic annex. She came alone. No legal team, no advisors, no visible recording equipment. She sat across the table from me and waited, and her silence was not hostile or defensive, it was attentive. The silence of someone who listens before they speak. I asked her why. She was quiet for a moment, not the performative pause of a diplomat choosing their words for maximum impact. A genuine pause. The pause of someone who wants to give an honest answer to a question they have thought about many times. She told me that humans have a long history of being told they owed debts they did not incur, by institutions that profit from the debt. She said that across their own civilization's past, there had been systems that extracted wealth from those who produced it, and concentrated that wealth among those who controlled the rules. Plantation economies, colonial administrations, financial structures that turned entire populations into debtors before they were born. She said that every one of those systems had justified itself through complexity, through tradition, through the solemn insistence that the existing order was the natural order, and that questioning it was either naive or dangerous. And she said that over thousands of years, through struggles I would never fully comprehend, because I had not lived them, her species had learned one lesson above all others. The best way to fight an unjust invoice is not to refuse to pay it. It is to audit the institution that sent it. There was no hatred in her voice, no triumph, no righteous fury. If anything, she seemed tired, not of the work, tired of the pattern, as though she had hoped that out here, among the stars, things would be different, as though discovering that they were not had cost her something she could not quite name. I asked her whether she felt sympathy for the species that had built and maintained the system, the founding civilizations, the bureaucrats like me. She set down the glass of water she had been holding and placed her hands flat on the table, and she looked at me with an expression I could not fully read. There was something in her eyes that might have been compassion and might have been exhaustion, and was probably both. She said something I have thought about every single day since that meeting. She said the people who enforce a corrupt system without knowing it is corrupt are not villains. They are the system's most important product. A system that relies on deliberate cruelty will eventually provoke resistance, because cruelty is visible, and people will oppose what they can see. But a system that convinces its own enforcers that it is fair will sustain itself for millennia, because the enforcers will defend it with genuine conviction, and genuine conviction is the most effective shield any institution can possess. She paused, And then she said something that struck me even harder. She said the council had not just exploited the tributary species. It had exploited its own auditors, its own administrators, its own honest professionals, by giving them a framework that looked legitimate and never permitting them to see the complete picture. She told me that the cruelest thing about the system was not what it did to the species that were overcharged. It was what it did to the people who enforced the overcharges while believing they were serving justice. I left that meeting and walked back to the bureau through corridors that felt different now, as though the walls had moved slightly while I was away. She had not blamed me. She had explained me, and understanding how I had been used was worse, far worse, than being accused. The council's response came on day 79. The 5 founding species convened under the Sovereign Authority Protocol and did the one thing that no amount of legal architecture, no matter how brilliantly constructed, could prevent. They invoked the sovereign override. Under the founding charter, the 5 original signatory species retained the right, by unanimous vote, to nullify any legal proceeding within council jurisdiction. No appeal, no review, no limitation. It had been used exactly twice in 11,000 years, and both times, the circumstances had been severe enough to justify the extraordinary measure in the judgment of most observers. This time, the circumstances were different. This time, the override was not being used to protect the council. It was being used to protect the founding species from the council's own rules. All counter-audit proceedings were declared void. All offsetting credit claims were rejected. All payment suspensions were ordered reversed. Earth's tribute assessment was reaffirmed in full, due in 11 days. The chief arbiter read the declaration with the gravity appropriate to a constitutional instrument of supreme authority. His voice was steady. His bearing was formal. He cited every relevant article of the founding charter and pronounced each legal term with the careful emphasis of someone who understands that the words he is speaking will be archived and studied for centuries. When he finished, he looked out at the chamber, and I could see from where I sat that he was searching the faces of the remaining delegates for reassurance, for approval, for the collective exhale that would signal the crisis was over and the natural order had been restored. He did not find it. What he found was a room full of species that were watching him with the cautious attention of people who have just seen someone demonstrate, clearly and irrevocably, the difference between authority and legitimacy. Authority is the power to nullify a legal proceeding. Legitimacy is the reason anyone should accept the nullification. The override supplied the first. It destroyed the second. For approximately 6 hours, it appeared that the old order had held. The founding species had played their highest card, the one that trumped every other card in the deck, and the game was over. But the humans had anticipated this move. I still do not know how, whether they had intelligence sources inside the council's deliberative chambers, or whether they had simply studied the founding charter carefully enough to predict that a system designed to protect the powerful would ultimately be used to protect the powerful when all other options were exhausted. What I know is that in the weeks preceding the override, the human delegation had been quietly, methodically, and comprehensively distributing copies of every piece of audit data they had compiled. Every calculation, every source document, every methodology note, every comparative analysis. They sent copies to every species in the coalition. They transmitted the complete dataset to the galactic press networks, to independent academic institutions on 40 different worlds, to the neutral arbitration courts that operated outside council jurisdiction, to data repositories maintained by species that had no stake in the outcome and no reason to suppress anything. By the time the override was announced, the information was not in a filing cabinet that could be sealed. It was in the hands of thousands of institutions across hundreds of worlds. It was being discussed, verified, cited, and built upon in academic papers and diplomatic briefings and trade association reports. It had become part of the galactic record in a way that no constitutional mechanism could reverse. The override did not suppress the findings. It confirmed them, because when the founding species used their supreme authority not to address the mathematical evidence, but to make it legally invisible, they told the galaxy exactly what the numbers had already implied. The system was not malfunctioning. The system was functioning precisely as it had been designed to function, and its designers would dismantle their own legal framework before they would permit accountability. I was in the observation gallery when Priya Vasant walked to the speaking floor on the morning of day 80. The chamber was full, every remaining seat occupied, every translator active, every recording system running. She stood at the podium, and she did not raise her voice. She did not display emotion. She did not make accusations or deliver a speech about justice or fairness or the moral obligations of civilization. She read a prepared statement that took less than 90 seconds to deliver, and in those 90 seconds, she ended the Galactic Council as I had known it for my entire adult life. The human species acknowledges the Council's invocation of the sovereign override. We note that this mechanism, by its own charter definition, applies exclusively to proceedings within Council jurisdiction. As of this moment, we invoke Article 9, Section 14 of the Founding Charter, which guarantees any member species the right of voluntary withdrawal from Council membership. Upon withdrawal, all tributary obligations cease. All audit findings remain part of the public galactic record and are not subject to override proceedings. We wish the Council well. She stepped away from the podium. She turned toward the exit. The chamber was absolutely still for a moment, as though the air itself had frozen. And then the Qth delegation rose. Their chief negotiator, a different one than the elder who had wept before me years ago, but carrying the same dignity and the same weight of generational sacrifice, stood and walked toward the exit without a word. Behind him, his entire delegation followed. Then the Morvani Federation. Their ambassador, a woman named Chorus Vale, who had served the Council faithfully for 40 years, and who I had personally considered a pillar of the institutional establishment, pushed back her chair and stood. She did not look at the founding species representatives. She did not look at the chief arbiter. She looked straight ahead, toward the exit, and she walked. Then the Alessi, then the Vreen Alliance, then the Korvathi Principates, then species whose names I had to check against the seating chart because I had not interacted with them in years, species from the outer corridors and the fringe sectors, species that had been so quiet and so compliant for so long that the Council had essentially forgotten they existed. They stood up. They walked out, some quickly, some slowly, some with visible emotion, and some with the careful composure of civilizations that had been rehearsing this moment in their minds for weeks and needed it to look exactly right. 46 delegations rose from their seats and walked out of the Grand Chamber behind a species that had been a member of galactic civilization for less than 2 years. I counted the empty seats, 47. The translation systems were still cycling. The chamber lights were still at full brightness. The environmental controls were maintaining optimal atmospheric conditions for species that were no longer present. And the silence was so complete, so absolute, so heavy with the weight of everything that had just changed, that I could hear my own pulse in my ears, steady and insistent, counting time in a room where time had just broken in half. The silence lasted longer than it should have. That is what I remember most clearly about the hours after the walkout, not the emergency sessions that were convened and then adjourned when it became clear that nobody had a plan, not the frantic communications between the remaining member species ambassadors, each one trying to assess whether their own civilization should be the next to leave. Not the chief arbiter standing at his podium in the Grand Chamber, addressing rows of empty chairs with a statement about institutional continuity that echoed off walls built for a full audience and sounded, in the depleted room, like something between a prayer and a concession speech. Not the junior staff members in the Bureau and the Treasury and the Diplomatic Corps walking through corridors that were suddenly too wide and too quiet, looking at one another with the shared disorientation of people who have just felt the organization they work for contract around them like a lung exhaling. What I remember is the silence, 47 empty seats, and a quiet so dense it had texture, like something you could reach out and touch, and hold in your hand and examine, and what you would find when you examined it was the shape of everything that had just ended. The economic consequences arrived faster than anyone had predicted. Within 72 hours, the Council's integrated trade network began to fracture along fault lines that the founding species had never mapped because they had never considered the possibility that they would need to. The departed species were not peripheral members. They were structural. 31 of them controlled critical nodes in the galactic supply chain. The Morvani Federation's commercial shipping fleet handled roughly 40% of all cargo moving through the outer trade corridors. The Alessi Communion managed the primary refining infrastructure for 7 rare elements, without which advanced manufacturing was functionally impossible. The Queth Collective maintained the navigational relay stations that enabled faster-than-light commerce across the entire eastern spiral arm. These species had not been passengers in the Council's economy. They had been the engine, the transmission, and the fuel, paying tribute for the privilege of doing the work that kept everything running. Without them, trade routes that had operated without interruption for centuries went quiet. Cargo shipments stalled at transit points where there was simply no alternative infrastructure to route them through. Resource prices swung wildly as markets that had relied on stable, tributary-subsidized supply chains suddenly faced the reality of genuine scarcity and genuine competition. The founding species, for the first time in their institutional memory, confronted the cost of running galactic infrastructure without the subsidies they had been extracting from their junior partners for millennia. The cost was considerable. The cost was, in fact, more than they could afford. I heard reports, unverified but credible, that the Drelvari hegemony's treasury reserves would be exhausted within 18 months if current spending continued without tributary revenue to offset it. Os Moravel, the same trade minister who had laughed at the humans in open session and called them hatchlings, was reportedly working 20-hour days trying to restructure trade agreements with species that no longer had any obligation to offer favorable terms. The laughter had stopped. The condescension had evaporated, like moisture in hard vacuum. What replaced it was something I had never seen on the face of a Drelvari official: uncertainty. I want to be precise about what happened next, because the simplified version that circulates on the galactic news networks does not do justice to what the humans actually accomplished. The simplified version says that the humans destroyed the Council and replaced it with their own system. That is not accurate. What the humans did was more subtle, more durable, and in many ways more remarkable than an act of destruction. 6 days after the walkout, the human delegation transmitted a proposal to every species that had departed the Council, and to 43 additional species that had privately indicated interest in an alternative arrangement. The proposal was called the Free Trade Compact, and it was the single most elegantly constructed economic governance framework I have ever encountered in my career. Not because of its complexity, because of its simplicity. The compact operated on 4 core principles, and I will state them as clearly as I can, because their clarity was the point. First, contribution rates would be calculated using a single transparent formula, applied identically to every member species without exception, exemption, or historical discount. Second, every rate calculation, including the formula itself and all input variables, would be published in full and made available for independent verification by any member species, any external institution, or any individual who wished to examine it. Third, there would be no backdated levies. A species' financial obligations to the compact began on the date it joined and extended forward from that date only. Fourth, the contribution formula could only be modified by a supermajority vote of all member species, and any proposed modification would be subject to the same transparency and verification requirements as the original formula. 4 principles, 7 pages. A child could have read it and understood what it meant, and that was precisely the point. After 11,000 years of a tributary code so dense that it concealed systemic corruption within its own complexity, the radical simplicity of the compact was not just a design choice, it was a statement. It said, "This is what governance looks like when it has nothing to hide." 60 species signed in the first week, 90 by the end of the second week, 112 by the end of the first standard month. Not because the humans lobbied or pressured or made promises, because the document was transparent, the math was verifiable, and the terms were the same for everyone. Species that had spent centuries navigating a system they could never fully understand suddenly had the option of joining one they could read in an afternoon. My own species, the Selvan, reached our decision point during this period. The Selvan Governing Council convened an emergency session to determine our course of action. The debate was intense. The traditionalists argued that the council would reform, that institutional continuity was more valuable than mathematical perfection, that 3,000 years of membership could not be discarded based on an 18-month investigation by a species that had barely arrived on the galactic stage. The pragmatists looked at the same data I had been staring at for weeks and drew the opposite conclusion. I was asked to present my professional assessment. I want you to understand the weight of that request. I was an auditor. My expertise was numbers, not politics. My entire professional identity was built on the institution I was now being asked to evaluate. Standing before the Selvan Governing Council and recommending departure from the Galactic Council was not just a professional act. It was a repudiation of everything I had spent my adult life believing. I lay awake the entire night before my presentation, staring at the ceiling of my quarters, running the numbers through my mind over and over again, as though repetition might change them. It did not. The numbers were what they were. They had been what they were for millennia. The only thing that had changed was that someone had finally assembled them in the correct order. I stood before the Governing Council the next morning, and I spoke for 2 hours. I showed them the data. I walked them through the human methodology, step by step, formula by formula. I demonstrated the rate discrepancies using our own species' payment history as one of the reference cases. When I showed them that the Selvan had been overpaying by a factor of 3.4 relative to species of comparable economic profile among the founding era members, the chamber went very quiet. When I showed them the cumulative overpayment across 3,000 years of membership, expressed as a percentage of our total national economic output during that period, the finance minister closed her eyes and did not open them for several seconds. I told them the truth. I told them the tributary system was mathematically indefensible and had been for its entire existence. I told them the human audit was not an attack but a diagnosis. I told them the override was proof that the founding species would sacrifice the rule of law before they would accept accountability. I told them the Free Trade Compact was not perfect, because no system designed by any species could be perfect, but that it was transparent, and that transparency was the minimum standard any civilization should demand from the institutions that govern its economic life. The vote was closer than it should have been. Old loyalties die slowly, even when the reasons for them have been exposed as hollow. But the Selvan joined the compact. I submitted my resignation from the Bureau of Tributary Compliance that afternoon, because the Bureau existed to enforce a system I could no longer defend, and continuing to hold a position within it would have been an act of dishonesty that I was no longer willing to commit. In the weeks that followed, the departures continued, not in a single dramatic wave but in a steady, quiet procession that was more devastating precisely because of its ordinariness. One species at a time, sometimes 2, sometimes 3, in a single day. The withdrawal notices arrived at the Council's administrative office in standard format, filed correctly, citing the appropriate articles, signed by the proper authorities. They were perfectly bureaucratic. That was the cruelest part. The species leaving the Council were doing so using the Council's own procedures, with the same meticulous attention to form that the Council had always demanded. They were not rebelling. They were filing paperwork, and each piece of paperwork removed another supporting beam from a structure that was already swaying. Each departure shifted the burden of remaining in the Council onto the members who stayed behind, because the infrastructure costs that had been distributed across 4,000 species now fell on a base that was shrinking by the week. Each increase in burden made the next departure more rational. The mathematics were inescapable. At a certain point, staying became more expensive than leaving for any species that did not have a founding-era exemption to shield it from the full weight of the cost. The founding species tried to stem the flow. They offered reforms, reduced rates, eliminated backdated levies for recently admitted species, proposed an independent oversight body with the authority to review rate calculations and investigate discrepancies. They published the reform proposal widely, translated into every diplomatic language, accompanied by statements of commitment and expressions of institutional humility that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier. Os Moravel himself, the same Drelvari minister who had mocked the humans, appeared on a galactic media network and spoke about the importance of listening to junior members and adapting institutional frameworks to reflect evolving standards of fairness. He did not mention the counter-audit. He did not mention the human findings. He spoke as though the reforms were a natural evolution of council policy, a sign of institutional maturity, rather than a desperate response to an existential threat. 5 years earlier, this performance would have been celebrated as a historic moment of generosity and self-reflection. Now it was transparent in a way that only made things worse. Everyone watching knew why the reforms were being offered. Everyone watching knew that if the humans had never filed their audit requests, the founding species would have continued collecting inflated tributes for another 11,000 years without a second thought. The species that had already left did not come back. Not because the reforms were insufficient, though in many cases they were, because the override had revealed something that no reform package could repair. The system had been rigged, and when the rigging was exposed, the architects had chosen to destroy the legal process rather than face judgment. Trust, once broken at that scale, does not heal through better offers. It does not respond to committee proposals or oversight mechanisms or promises of future accountability. It ends, and what comes after it must be built on entirely different foundations. I received a formal notice from the Bureau of Tributary Compliance informing me that the Bureau had been dissolved. My position, along with every other position in the department, had been eliminated. I held the notice in my hands and read it twice. I expected to feel loss, grief perhaps, for the career I had devoted my life to. What I felt instead surprised me. Relief. Clean, simple, uncomplicated relief. The sensation of setting down a weight I had been carrying for so long that I had forgotten I was carrying it. 1 year has passed since the walkout, and I still sometimes reach for the old protocols. It happens in the mornings, usually, before my mind has fully caught up with the present. I will sit down at my workstation, in the Free Trade Compact's Transparency Division, and my hands will move toward the encrypted filing system before I remember that there is no encrypted filing system. Everything I produce is published. Every calculation I perform is available for review by any species, any institution, any individual who wants to look. The work is the same. I still audit contribution rates. I still verify formulas. I still compare actual payments against prescribed obligations. The difference is that when I finish, I do not seal the results in a classified file. I post them on a public dashboard where 219 species can read them before I have finished my morning meal. Some mornings, the openness still feels strange, like stepping out of a building I lived in for decades and discovering that there were windows the whole time, just bricked over from the inside. The Compact's headquarters is a station called Meridian Point, constructed jointly by 37 species in a neutral sector that none of the founding council species had ever claimed. It is functional rather than grand. The corridors are clean but unornamented. The conference rooms have standard lighting and plain walls. There are no ceremonial galleries or architectural monuments to the civilizations that built it. The session chambers have public seating that is usually occupied because citizens of member species have discovered that watching the proceedings of an institution that actually publishes its methodology is considerably more interesting than watching the proceedings of one that does not. The rate tables are displayed on screens in the main concourse, updated in real time, and any person from any member world can walk up to any screen and see exactly what their civilization pays, exactly how that number was calculated, and exactly how it compares to what every other civilization pays. I saw a young Queth student standing in front of one of those screens last month, studying the numbers with the intense focus of someone who is seeing something they were told was impossible. She noticed me watching and asked me if the display was accurate. I told her it was. She asked me how she could verify it. I showed her the methodology link at the bottom of the screen. She spent 20 minutes reading it right there in the concourse, and when she was done, she looked at me with an expression I will never forget. It was not gratitude, it was recognition. The recognition of someone who has just discovered that a system can be understood, and that understanding is not a privilege reserved for those who run it. The transparency is not a feature of the Compact, it is the Compact. Without it, the institution would have no reason to exist, and it works. Imperfectly, sometimes awkwardly, with all the friction and inefficiency and difficult public debate that comes from allowing everyone to see everything. But it works, and after what came before, the imperfections feel like virtues. The old council still exists. I check on it occasionally, the way a person who has moved to a new city might read news from their old neighborhood. 83 species remain. The founding 5, their closest dependents, and a diminishing number of smaller civilizations that either cannot afford the transition costs of departure or genuinely believe the council will recover its former position. The Grand Chamber at Cerethos still convenes on its regular schedule. The protocols still run. The translators still cycle. But the seats are more than half empty, and the debates have acquired a hollow resonance, the sound of voices speaking in a room that was built for a crowd but occupied by a remnant. I have spent the past year trying to understand what the humans accomplished, not the mechanics. The mechanics are clear enough that I could teach them to a first-year auditing student. Receive an unjust demand. Accept the demand's own framework as your tool. Apply that framework with total consistency. Expose the inconsistencies. Let the math do the work. The mechanics are simple. What I have been trying to understand is something about the nature of the species that executed them. For months, I believed the counter-audit was a weapon, a calculated assault on the Council's power structure, planned from the moment the humans received their assessment, designed to destabilize the existing order and replace it with a human-led alternative. This was a comfortable explanation, because it fit every pattern I had observed in galactic politics. Species compete for dominance. Species use whatever tools they possess. The humans had used accounting instead of armaments, but the underlying motivation was the same: power, control. The oldest story in the galaxy, told in new language. I no longer believe that. The reason I no longer believe it is that I have watched the humans operate inside the compact for a full year, and their behavior does not match the behavior of a species pursuing dominance. They hold no special position in the compact's governance structure. They have one vote, identical in weight to every other member species. They declined the rotating chairmanship when it was offered to them, twice. Their administrative contribution is substantial, but not controlling. When disputes arise between member species, the humans do not arbitrate. They provide relevant data, cite applicable provisions of the compact's framework, and then they step back and let the parties resolve the matter themselves. I watched this happen firsthand during a dispute between the Korvathi Principates and the Vreen Alliance over resource transit fees. The human representative assigned to the case, a man named Daniel Osei who had an annoying habit of being right about everything, compiled a comprehensive data package showing historical transit volumes, comparable fee structures among similar species, and 3 different resolution frameworks that the parties could choose from. He presented the data, answered technical questions for 2 hours, and then he excused himself. When the Korvathi representative asked him which framework he recommended, he said it was not his decision to make, and that the data would support any of the 3 options. The Korvathi looked confused. The Vreen looked suspicious, but they worked it out between themselves, using the data the human had provided, and the resolution was fair. Not because a powerful species imposed it, because the information was transparent enough that both parties could see what fair looked like. They built a system that they then subjected themselves to, and that is not what conquerors do. What I have come to believe, after 12 months of working alongside them and watching them, and occasionally engaging in spirited disagreements about auditing methodology that they seem to enjoy far more than any reasonable species should, is something both simpler and more unsettling. The humans possess a deep, structural intolerance for systems that claim authority without submitting to accountability. Not as a political stance, not as an ideology that they adopted at some point in their development and might discard at another. As something foundational, something embedded in the way they evaluate institutions and power structures and claims of legitimacy. They do not object to rules. They do not resist governance. They do not rebel against contribution or sacrifice or collective obligation. They rebel against rules that exempt the rule-makers. They rebel against governance that demands transparency from the governed, while maintaining opacity for the governors. They rebel against the specific, precise, identifiable hypocrisy of a system that applies its own standards selectively and punishes anyone who points out the discrepancy. This means the humans were never fighting the concept of galactic governance. They were fighting the dishonesty of a galactic governance that pretended to be fair while operating as an engine of extraction, and the weapon they used was not cleverness or aggression or political maneuvering. It was the one thing the system could not defend against: consistency. They took the Council's own stated principles and applied them consistently, and the system collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. I encountered Priya Vasant at a compact administrative meeting 3 months ago. She has moved out of the lead representative role and into the compact's data governance division, where she works on the systems that ensure contribution calculations remain transparent and verifiable as the membership expands. It is a quieter position, less visible. She seems to prefer it. I approached her during a recess in the proceedings, and I told her something I had been carrying for a year. I told her that I was the auditor who delivered the original tribute assessment to Earth. I was the mechanism of the system she dismantled. I was the hand that placed the invoice on the table in front of her and told her, through my presence and my authority and my 31 years of institutional credibility, that the number was correct and the obligation was just. I told her this because I needed her to know, and because the weight of it had been pressing against the inside of my chest for 12 months, and I needed to set it down somewhere. She listened. She was quiet for a moment, and then she told me something that I suspect I will carry with me for the rest of my life, alongside every other memory from this experience. She said she never blamed the auditors. She said the auditors believed the system was fair because they were never given reason to question it, and that believing in the fairness of the system you serve is not a moral failing when the system has been specifically designed to prevent you from seeing its true nature. The architects, she said, the ones who buried the exemptions in the complexity, the ones who wrote the override clause, the ones who designed a structure of systematic wealth extraction and wrapped it in the language of civilizational duty and shared contribution, and called it fair. Those are the ones who bear responsibility. And she told me that the fact that I was here now, sitting in this room, doing this work in the open, building something transparent, was not an indictment of my past. It was proof that the old system failed its own people, as completely as it failed the species it exploited. I was not a villain in the story. I was another casualty of the same machine. I wanted to argue with her. Part of me still wanted to accept more blame, to insist that a competent auditor should have caught the discrepancies without help, that ignorance was not innocence, that 31 years of service to a corrupt institution could not be resolved by a change of employer. But she was right, and the impulse to claim more guilt than the facts supported was, I realized, its own kind of evasion. A way of centering myself in a story that was not about me. The system was designed to make people like me invisible to themselves. It succeeded for 31 years, and then it encountered a species that could see through the design. The Council's final Founding Species Summit was held last month. I followed it through public reporting channels. The 5 founding species convened for what was officially described as a strategic realignment conference. It lasted 4 days. No joint statement was issued at its conclusion. 2 of the 5 founding species have opened private negotiations with the Compact regarding potential membership under the standard terms. No special privileges, no exemptions, no founding species status. The other 3 continue to maintain, publicly, that the Council is the legitimate governing body of galactic civilization. But they have quietly suspended tribute collection because there is nearly no one left to collect from, and the administrative cost of maintaining the collection infrastructure now exceeds the revenue it generates. The institution is not collapsing dramatically, it is fading. The way obsolete systems always fade, not in fire, but in irrelevance, settling over the grand chambers and ornate corridors like sediment on a riverbed, layer by quiet layer, until the original surface is no longer visible. I am telling you all of this, Taurus, because you asked me what happened, and because you are young enough and early enough in your career that you deserve to hear the full account from someone who was present for every stage of it. You asked me what the lesson is. I have spent a year thinking about my answer, and I want to give it to you carefully, because easy lessons are usually incomplete ones, and the ones that sound the best are often the ones that matter the least. The most dangerous thing about the old tributary system was not its corruption. Corruption, when it is visible, provokes resistance. Corruption, in a certain light, is almost honest, because the people involved generally know what they are doing and can be held to account for it. An openly corrupt system generates its own opposition because people can see the injustice and name it and organize against it. The most dangerous thing about the old system was how reasonable it looked from the inside, how orderly, how procedurally sound. Every form was correct, every number was verified, every protocol was followed precisely, every deadline was met, every filing was stamped and sealed and archived in accordance with the Bureau's quality standards, which were among the highest in galactic public administration. Every auditor, myself very much included, went home at the end of each working day, satisfied that they had done honest work in the service of a fair institution. We believed it. We believed it because everything we could see confirmed it, and everything that contradicted it was invisible to us. Not because we were stupid, because the invisibility was the design, and the institution was still a machine for extraction. It took wealth from the vulnerable and delivered it to the powerful, and it did this not through force or fraud or overt corruption, but through complexity. The system was so large, so layered, so encrusted with precedent and procedure and historical accumulation that no one inside it could see the whole picture. You could spend an entire career in the Bureau, as I did, and never once encounter the information that would have revealed the truth. Not because the information was hidden, because it was scattered across so many files, so many jurisdictions, so many databases, that assembling it into a coherent picture would have required a perspective that the system itself made structurally impossible to achieve from the inside. The humans brought that perspective, not because they were smarter than us, or more virtuous, or more determined, because they were new, because they were outside the assumptions and the habits and the unexamined traditions that had accumulated over millennia like sediment over stone. They had no institutional memory telling them the system was sound. They had no 31 years of career investment telling them the formula was fair. They had no colleagues and mentors and professional networks reinforcing the belief that the status quo was the only possible arrangement. They came in from outside, with nothing but the methodology I gave them and the stubborn, infuriating, magnificent refusal to accept any claim that could not be verified. They took the methodology, and they treated it not as a set of rules to be obeyed, but as a set of claims to be tested. And when they tested those claims against the evidence, the claims failed. That is all that happened. Someone finally checked the math, and the math was wrong. The humans have a word for what they did. They do not call it a revolution. They do not call it a war or a conquest or a political victory. They call it a reckoning. I spent months assuming that word meant punishment, vengeance, the settling of scores. I have since learned enough of their language to understand that it means something older and considerably more precise. It comes from a root word that means to count, to calculate, to examine an account and determine what it actually contains. A reckoning is not retribution. A reckoning is the moment when someone opens the books and counts again, carefully, thoroughly, without assumptions, and arrives at the true total for the first time. That is what the humans gave the galaxy. Not a new empire, not a new hierarchy, not a new set of rulers to replace the old ones. They gave us the simple, devastating, irreversible gift of accurate accounting. They counted what the council had been doing, counted it correctly, and showed the results to everyone. And the galaxy, confronted with numbers it could verify for itself, chose differently. Not because the humans told it to, because the math was clear. Remember that, Taurus. Remember it every time you sit down at your workstation and open a file and begin to work. The numbers are never just numbers. They are a record of who takes and who gives, and whether the exchange is honest. If those numbers are wrong, whether through malice or negligence, or the quiet accumulation of small compromises over long centuries, then everything built on top of them is a structure without a foundation. It will stand for a while, held up by habit and authority, and the simple fact that no one has checked. But eventually, someone will check. Someone always does. And when they do, the reckoning arrives. Count carefully, count accurately, and never stop asking whether the formula is being applied the same way to everyone. That is the only lesson that matters. It is the lesson the humans taught a galaxy that had forgotten how to count. And it is the reason you and I are sitting in this office, on this station, doing this work, in a universe that has finally, painfully, and for the first time, begun to keep honest books.